Nvidia's Ampere lineup of graphics cards is easily the most impressive launch we've seen since Pascal. And after the relatively lukewarm reception of the first generation of RTX cards, it was refreshing as an enthusiast to see general enthusiasm in the community surrounding a product launch. Admittedly, however, we also saw a similar phenomenon with last year's Zen 2 launch, but that's besides the point. What I'm getting at is, the community was genuinely excited for the release of a product, and Nvidia had all the marketing budget to back all of this up, only for us to be hit with out-of-stock labels on release night. Man, what a buzzkill. Alright, so I know the default argument as to why the cards immediately sold out on release night is scalpers using bots to buy up as many as possible. Now, while I think that definitely didn't help the situation, Nvidia ultimately created this problem through conscious decisions made from the top down, which created a strained state of supply that was far below the expected demand. Not only are Nvidia only producing a very limited quantity of their Founders Edition SKU, I think the way they're handling this specific SKU is, from a business perspective, absolutely genius, but from a consumer perspective, easy to perceive as shady and manipulative. However, there are two different aspects that we can analyze to explore the specific perception of Nvidia that's currently beginning to take hold. The first is the engineering aspects, which includes the overall construction, design, and quality of their Founders Edition SKU. And the second is the business perspective, with the seeming move to capitalize on the lack of AMD's current generational presence in the GPU market at the moment. So let's decompress each of these stances and explore how and why Nvidia botched the launch of what could have been the greatest generation Nvidia has released since Maxwell. Alright, so let's dive into the design of the RTX 30 series Founders Edition cards in terms of overall design objectives. The first and most important objective set forth by Nvidia with this generation's Founders Editions seems to be cooling. This is evident through the overall deviation in design for the host PCB, which allowed Nvidia to shorten and chop out chunks of the area at will. Traditionally, and here I've got two Founders Edition cards just for reference, the PCB is a full rectangular board without any weird shapes cut in it or whatnot. I know it hasn't always been like this, however, looking from the perspective of a thermal engineer, Nvidia has traditionally isolated a majority of the cooling action to the bottom side of the board. And with both of these cards, the size of the copper block and fins is nearly identical, and the fans which push air through the heat sinks are also of identical diameters, voltages, and amperage, meaning that the volume of air available to the heat sinks is identical. Nvidia changed this up with the 20 series and vastly increased the area available to the heatsink, along with adding an additional fan, while giving each individual fan more throughput capacity. This was most likely due to the massive increase in die size and power requirements of touring over Pascal, which necessitated the introduction of a more exotic cooling solution than, well, this. But jokes aside, Nvidia designing their 20 series Founders Edition cards to have this beefy cooling solution was a great step forward for them, and it was so competitive with high-end third-party cooling solutions that if you wanted the best overclocking experience without paying tons of money, then the 20 series Founders Edition was pretty much the way to go, because its cooling solution was significantly overbuilt. And this sort of change in design philosophy from designing your chip around your cooling capacity and into more of designing a cooling solution around the needs of your chip, Nvidia opened themselves up to more exotic and effective solutions, which ultimately gave us a better experience. However, Nvidia also knew that their Founders Edition cards were overbuilt, and they charged an extra $100 on top of the MSRP for almost all Founders Edition flavors, except for the 2060 for whatever reason. And moving into the release of the 30 series and the massive dies and power requirements that Ampere brought along with it, Nvidia also opted to overbuild their Founders Edition cooling solutions, which gave way to the RTX 3090 Air Conditioner Edition. Coming in at 3 PCIe slots in height and over a foot long, you have to realize how much of this thing is just heatsink. Here's a view of the card, and keep in mind that the actual circuitry that's running is confined to just this highlighted area. It's absolutely nuts that you're getting more heatsink than graphics card this generation, but it was all done intentionally. First, let's take a look at the shape of the PCB, which is very unusual for any sort of graphics cards, but keep in mind that this is not the reference board. The reference flavor is built on a full-length PCB like previous generation versions, so compatibility with accessories such as AIO brackets will be limited if you decide to invest in a Founders Edition this generation. In terms of the actual board layout, main power delivery and VRMs are located on two sides of the chip, and the tight layout of the GDDR6X triggers an OCD level of satisfaction in me. But it also makes me wonder how much HBM might have cleaned up the look. It's overall very intricately crafted, and it makes me appreciate the efforts that they took to put this card together. However, one of the drawbacks that came along with the upgrade to the Ampere architecture with this generation of cards was excessive power draw, meaning that the cooling solution had to be much more intricate and potent than what was previously offered. So in an effort to reserve area for uninterrupted heatsink space, they crammed all the components of the board together and cut a chunk out of the back of it. Yet that alone must have provided some significant advantage for cooling, or else Nvidia wouldn't have done it. The overall construction of the card is also very high quality, and none of the pieces are cheap. In fact, the cost of the heatsink, which is estimated to be between $150 to $200, is more than what most third-party distributors would pay for their highest tier model. Based on some reports from 3080 Founders Edition owners, the card is able to easily overclock well in excess of the rated boost clock, and can actually max out its frequencies before you hit a wall past a certain power level. All of this is done while the GPU remains well under 80 degrees Celsius, and there isn't any thermal throttling occurring. When you look at the design of the cooler without the PCB in the way, it actually sort of looks like a Hyper 212 Evo that's been flattened then bent at the ends. And if you've seen the video of Linus strapping an Assassin 3 to a 2080 Ti, you know that a configuration like that works incredibly well. And Nvidia built the Founders Edition this generation to be the top performing flavor, rather than making a functional card with a cooler that just keeps the chip within operational spec. And like I mentioned earlier, these cooling assemblies are not cheap to manufacture, and since the Founders Edition cards are priced at MSRP, that means you're actually getting the best performance for the least amount of money when compared to third-party options. This can arguably get misleading, however, when Nvidia uses these Founders Edition cards for promotional purposes. Like previously mentioned, Nvidia is offering arguably the best available flavor of their cards to reviewers for third-party analysis. This is perfectly normal for companies to do for promotional purposes, and there's no problem with sending out the cards. However, the problem comes when you're sending out these samples with the most capable cooling configuration that will allow the chip to attain the highest rated clock speed, and then limit the public release of that said SKU to less than 1,000. From an enthusiast perspective, this behavior is beyond frustrating because it comes across as Nvidia sending out golden samples, which others in the industry have been accused of for literally years. Intel comes to mind for often being accused of this behavior, with some calling cherry-picked CPU dies for certain reviewers back when the 8th Gen Core series released. However, if you looked at a series of performance figures, rather than from a single source, you'll find that some individual chips were a hair slower or a hair faster than others, basically within the margin of error. Sometimes though, there was a significant margin, and that's just because they overclocked the snot out of the chips with extravagant cooling. That's because though, within a wafer, there are imperfections in literally every single die they're producing. Some dies have worse defects than others, meaning they can be partially disabled and repurposed as a lower core count chip, but this can also manifest in power characteristics, most prevalently through the amount of voltage needed to bump to a given frequency. If one chip has more of these imperfections than another, but they're identical when it comes to specs and you can hit the target clock speed at the target voltage, then they won't perform any differently at stock clocks. However, the chip with less imperfections will need less voltage when trying to overclock or increase some random bus speed. Just for example, I kinda lost the silicon lottery hard with my 9700K, only hitting a stable all-core of 5 GHz at 1.32 volts. And I also didn't get that great of a 1080, with my core clocks hitting a wall at just under 2100 MHz. This is perfectly normal, and manufacturers even take these small imperfections into account when binning the chips, even though they may be identical from a specification standpoint. This same luck of the draw is also experienced by the tech press when they receive cards and chips, and that generally explains why some test results can be better on one chip rather than another. However, when you're also shipping it with a cooling solution designed to leave headroom for high power draw that not every model has, that's where it kinda gets a little shady. Specifically with the Founders Edition, the number of actual cards that were released was incredibly small, basically for the tech press and anyone who was able to pre-order within the first 24 hours. That means the press, who are writing the reviews that will be referenced for literally years down the line, are getting the best version of the product, while almost no one else is able to get the same product at performance level, not even to mention at the same price. Now, I understand why they made the decision to do this, because it's brilliant from a marketing standpoint. But once Nvidia starts to actually release more chips to the third-party vendors, there's going to be a bit of a discrepancy that's going to be immediately noticeable. For example, say I watched an RTX 3080 review and decided to buy one because of the review. However, since the cards from Nvidia are out of stock, the only other option is to buy one for at least over $1,000. And when you finally get the thing in your hands and plug it in, suddenly your chip isn't hitting the same clock speeds as the review you watched because the cooling solution just isn't as good as the one Nvidia engineered in-house. Obviously, I'm making the situation sound horrific, but after AMD releases their competitor to all of this, Nvidia is going to get caught with their pants down, and it's going to be interesting to watch how all of this goes down. It's not the end of the world, but for now we're just going to have to wait because we're at the mercy of Nvidia at the moment, and we'll have to see how this changes when their competitor crests the hill. So, thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. Let me know what you guys think of the new Ampere cards, especially since the 3070 release was pushed back to later this month. Personally, I think it's an interesting improvement over Turing, and I'm eager to get my hands on one eventually. But I'm ultimately more interested in the underlying tech and how it could change the game moving forward. But it was fun talking, and if you want to learn more about computer hardware, software, then the annotations on screen are a great place to start. Thanks for spending your time with me, and thanks for watching.